volunteers. Welcome to the bucket courses. I'm glad so many of you braved the rain this morning to come out for our bucket class. I will start out by reminding you to please silence your cell phone and turn on your tea coil. And I want to thank Joanne Britton for hosting for me last week. I'm Joanne Bundy. This gets to be a little confusing to try to keep us straight. You will notice, well, first of all, next week is the last class before our summer break. But we're not going to leave you without community education for the summer. And you will notice that you have a brochure on your chair of the ACES. That stands for Adult Community Exploration Series. And that will be starting on June 14th and last through the end of August, or the end of July, I'm sorry. And you're going to have to figure out what to do with your Wednesday mornings during the month of August. I can't help you there. But the ACES classes will be at this same room, same time on Wednesday mornings. So you'll stay in the habit of coming to class on Wednesday morning from 10 until 11:30. Now, to register for that, you'll notice that there is a blank in your brochure. You can fill this out and send it to the college or leave it on the table in the hallway, and we will see that the college gets it. By the way, this the ACES is sponsored by Grinnell College in partnership with the Community Education Center. So that is why we don't have any tuition for the summer, but we do like to have you register so they have a general idea of how many people will be attending. So fill that out, or you can also call the college or email them to register. So we hope to see a lot of you this summer for the ACES courses. And now it's story time again with Professor Good. I know that you're eager to hear what he has to say today about Joe Rosenfield and Grinnell College. And I'm always happy to present our Professor of History Emeritus at Grinnell College, Professor George Drake.
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thank all of you for coming out today. I was out walking a dog this morning in the middle of the deluge. I can tell you it was not fit for man or beast. What we've done so far, just to remind you very quickly, is we spent one class looking at Joe's family, his background, particularly focused on the connection with the Anchor Company, but also Joe's many activities in Des Moines, and really known as the premier philanthropist in Des Moines, and probably one could say almost in the state of Iowa. Then the second time we delved into Joe the humorist. Joe's time as a student at Grinnell. We looked at the character of the college back in the early 1920s, and also the way that Joe responded, and the key here is to try to figure out, and you can hear me okay in the back, is to try to figure out what it was that caused Joe to love Grinnell College so much. Because, and then combining his love and his skill, then we get the endowment building that we have today. So where we are now is to actually finally begin to talk about Joe as a trustee. It's 59 years as a trustee, and in the process, it'll be a quasi-history of Grinnell College as well. Today I'm probably, it's a little hard for me to figure out how far we're going to get, but we should get through about the first 30 or more years of Joe's time as a trustee, and it'll be a focus on two college administrations. In a way, you hate to tell the history of a college according to presidential administration, but it almost inevitably falls into that pattern. I remember when I asked Joe Wall and commissioned him to write a history of the college, which he did for the 19th century, I said, I hope we don't fall into, I trust you, we won't fall into the pattern that it's just a series of presidential administrations, and it wasn't. Although, as I said last time, his hero was the last of the 19th century presidents, George Gates. I just handed Gene Webbles a copy of Gates' inaugural address, which I had said to Gene. I had the chance to read it because of Nancy Valley, and well, there's Nancy right back there. And I said, what you have here is the college that Grinnell is today. The vision of Gates was what produced what we have today. So that's another reason to think of him as extremely important. And presidents do make a difference. I guess I have to confess that. So we're going to talk about Doc Sam and Joe. I'm going to just show of hands how many of us in the room were students at Grinnell College when Doc Sam was the president. Good sprinkling of hands. Then we're also going to get into Howard Bowen very much. How many of in the room were at the college when Howard was the president? And just about even. So in a way, I'm talking to the choir in the sense that what I'm talking about, you experienced in some form as a student. Now, I used to say, sort of facetiously, that if Grinnell was ever going to die, it was when I was a student, from 1952 to 1956. And having been through this research on the Joe Rosenfield biography, particularly the trustee minutes, I now can say almost definitively, yes, if Grinnell, it's certainly one of those times, if Grinnell would have died, it would have been them. And yet, those of us who were there as students got a fine education. It wasn't as good then as it is today, certainly. But it was a very fine education. I was an indifferent high school student, 79th in my high school class. No problem getting into Grinnell. If you were warm and ambulatory, you could get into Grinnell in those days. Emily Fitch could tell you about John going off to Chicago with a commission that for every student he rustled up, he got $25. And it was a bounty system. And you're going to hear some things that Stevens had to say about the students that were not very complimentary about our era of students. And yet, we got a fine education. And when Don Smith, toward the end of Howard Bowen's time as president, was talking with him about what Howard found when he came to Grinnell, he said, one thing I found was a good teaching faculty. That was the best thing about the college. And some of the best faculty members in the history of the college were there. Neil Klausner, Joe Wall, this kind of person. And some of the weaker ones. I mean, it was a very mixed bag with respect to what the quality of the faculty was. So it was a lot of tumult, particularly at our time. Stevens left in '54, so we got the end of Sam Stevens in my class, and there are several of us who are classmates of '56 here. Then we got an interim year of Rupert Hawk, and we got the first year of Howard Bowen. So we had an interesting experience with respect to presidents. But the place was chaotic when we were students, and most of us didn't know it. We kind of, around the edges, heard a little bit, and we had our own opinions. But we were not dragged into it in the way that current students, or students certainly of the 60s and 70s, would have been involved. So, Joe's first president was Doc Sam Stevens. Joe became a trustee on November 29th, 1941, exactly a week before Pearl Harbor. I just checked. I forget whether they're 30 or 31 days in November. They're 30. So, December 7th is coming very, very quickly. So, Joe's time as a trustee, I mean, when you think about the ride any college went through, certainly Grinnell, the war comes, virtually every able-bodied man is going to be drafted, or is going to go into the service. So you're reduced to a student body of mostly women. My dad was a college president in those years, Little Doane College over in Nebraska. I was a kid growing up on that campus during the war. And all of the civilian students, virtually, were women. But there was a naval unit. I used to have a lot of fun with my machine gun, mowing them down as they went to dinner. And the guys in the back where the chief wasn't watching would stagger. So I played war all the time on that campus, and I was surrounded by all these Navy guys. What saved Grinnell was a military unit. Art was in that unit. How many months were you in that unit, Art?
6 months.
6 months. So Art experienced that. Roughly about 700 Army folks were on campus. That saved the college. It was Joe who moved that Sam Stevens go off to Washington to negotiate for this, because we didn't know how long the war was going to last, and we needed officers. These were officer training units for the most part on these college campuses. And it's what God's. But when you think you're dealing with that kind of thing, and then we're going to get into the influx of veterans coming back after the war under the GI Bill, and the enrollment's going to balloon to 1,200. College had never seen anything like that. The trustees are worried. When are we going to get back to normal? It's interesting to read that now with all the focus on enrollment. So anyway, let's get into this story. Joe came on the board because, the person who suggested him was the chair, Fred Little, who is the father of the current Fred Little that we know. Fred Little's, three generations of Littles have served as chair of the board of Grinnell. Fred Sr., Fred Jr., and his daughter Caroline, Fred's daughter. So it's an interesting thing that Fred, the Fred I know, the Fred that I was in college with, feels very, very proud of that. And Joe came on because he was a close friend. They played tennis together, that sort of thing. So at his first meeting, he hears about the deficit the previous year was $48,000. And Stevens said, "Can the Midwest support a first-rate liberal arts college? The college must build or die. There is no middle ground," says Stevens. So even, we're talking here about 1941, before the war even begins, there's a crisis. They're barely staggering out of the Great Depression. So students' enrollment has been down, salaries have been down. Grant Gale would talk about the 30s as, in a way, almost the most wonderful time in Grinnell College history. The faculty voluntarily sacrificed cuts in salary so that nobody would lose their job. Let's each of us take a little bit less, and then we'll all be employed. Let's get through this time. So there was a great spirit at Grinnell College, but lots and lots of difficulties. Joe also found out at that meeting that the endowment was positively, you could say, about $100,000, including the dormitories, including farms, of which $20,000 was pledged to the banks on the loan. So he said effectively it was about an $80,000 endowment. And right there, he concluded this college will never make it without an endowment, without building the endowment. So one can say that right at the beginning, Joe decided one of the things I can do is help this, and I need to do, and we have to do, is help this institution to build an endowment. And I think it was his second meeting when he pledged $10,000 and asked 10 other trustees to equal his pledge, and no one stepped up. But that's how Joe raised money. And Tom Marshall, who had, I'd say, the pleasure of being the vice president for development at Grinnell for about 10 years. When I interviewed Tom, just before he died, I said, "Have you got any negatives about," I always ask this question, "any negatives about Joe?" And he said, "Well, Joe misunderstood how difficult it was to raise money. Joe could always do it pretty well. Joe's way of doing this saying, here's what I'm giving, now what about you?" That isn't what everybody can or will do as a fundraiser. So Joe thought it was pretty easy to raise money, although he found out at that meeting that it wasn't actually quite so easy. The enrollment, by the way, when Stevens had been there about a year, when he came was 550, coming out of the Depression. So it's a struggling college. In fact, just before Stevens arrived, John Nolan, the president, and Louis Phelps, the treasurer, had driven to Chicago to get a loan so they could make payroll. None of the Chicago banks that they met with that day would loan, so they got in the car that day, drove back, got back to Grinnell about 1 in the morning, and immediately, I don't know, they got a change of clothes or something, drove off to Des Moines through the night, and that morning met with the Des Moines banks and did get the loan they needed in order to keep the doors open and to pay the faculty and staff. Joe, by the way, was immediately elected to the executive committee of the board. Now by this time, he's a very substantially placed person in Des Moines. There are, probably at that time, 8 or 10 trustees are from Des Moines. So he's well regarded in Des Moines. And they realize this is a person, immediately realize this is a person who can make a difference. So put him on the executive committee. Today, in the contemporary Grinnell board, being on the executive committee doesn't amount to much. You might be consulted, in the absence of the board on some things. But back in those days, the executive committee met almost monthly in Des Moines. Fort Des Moines Hotel, Des Moines Club, you name it. So in a way, the executive committee really did act on behalf of the board a lot. So it was really quite important to be on the executive committee. So when the war begins, and this is certainly the case when Joe comes to his second meeting, Stevens, I think quite properly, says this is the third, at least the third major crisis the college has faced, the move from Davenport and the Civil War. He said, I would have to say maybe the 1882 tornado that destroyed the campus would be equally impactful. Enrollment had dropped to about 400 pretty quickly, and that's when in 42 Sam goes off to Washington and is successful in getting a military unit, and that actually is going to lead to a fair amount of financial stability because the government does have funds to pay for those units, but except in in the form of grants, the government tends to pay you after the fact rather than before the fact. So they always paid at the end of the semester rather than the beginning. And that's going to be the case with the GI Bill, too. GI Bill payments came in at the end of the semester when the GI had actually performed and was still a student in good standing, not at the beginning of the semester. So it always made things unsettled. And so it means that all the time you're functioning with temporary bank loans to cover the absence of tuition until the tuition comes in. So that I would say virtually every official board meeting, not the executive committee, but every board meeting in this period that I was looked at, there was discussion of borrowing at every meeting. How much shall it be this time? What will the terms of it? Is it short term? Is it longer term borrowing? So the college is constantly living hand to mouth. The college did have to build 2 buildings in order to meet the requirements of the military: Darby Gymnasium and Cole's Dining Hall. The dining hall previously had been in the basement of Langham. And so this wasn't large enough to accommodate all the great influx of males. These aren't women, these are all males, so they needed a male dining room, and, as well as more space. Cole's was built in response to that, but again, the government was helping. Now you can see almost immediately in the minutes, and it's not in a direct form, it's sort of seeing what's happening, and then knowing Joe, you can see that he's driving. I'm making a leap here in terms of historical argument, but I think it's a very safe leap. The college starts to sell farms and invest in equities. And the farms, any one of you in this room, living around this region would know farming is problematic. And to own farms may or may not be profitable, because as the owner you have to maintain the farm. And so some years the farms produced income, net income, sometimes they did not. So it was very insecure for them. And the dorms are marginal with respect to income. I suppose you could cut costs and make the dorms pay for themselves, or you could actually provide services for the students and clean rooms and so on, and keep the dorms physically maintained and so on. And then if you're doing that, you're probably not going to make much money. And, there were strange things that we found when we were students. The women didn't find. I guess I'm the only male from my particular class here. We had maids. They sometimes made your bed. The women, look at the women shaking their heads. What can I say? So there was more maintenance staff for that kind of thing than you would have today. And nobody's making anybody bed. on the staff today, and they certainly did not on South Campus. The women, but I guess they assumed we were such dolts that there was no way we could make a bed. Well, we were. Well, what did I do every week? I took my laundry box down to, about sometimes the only time I went into town, I took my laundry box down to our post office, sent it off to my mother, she washed my clothes, she sent it back to me with brownies in it. We still have that metal box up at our cabin, trying to keep the mice out of whatever got in it. Well, we were, and you'll find out when I quote from Stevens what dolts we really were. Also, that for the first time, the college, very shortly after Joe arrives, they have an audit, a formalized audit. And it just about devastated Louis Phelps, because the books were a mess. Louis was not an accountant. He was a lot of things. He was running buildings and grounds, he was the treasurer, he was the secretary of the college. All three big jobs. He had a secretary to help him. So right after the Arthur Anderson did the audit, and he got this dismal report why they hired Chick Kaufman as a controller. And so now Louis has professional help in the office to help him to straighten out the books. And so that particular crisis is past. But of course, I haven't seen that audit, but I'll bet there are a lot of interesting things in it and surprises, if in fact the auditors actually could figure anything out. Of course, you and I might have been able to figure it out, but as we know, accountants do it in a language in a form that none of us can understand. That's my gratuitous comment. But, I mean, thank goodness for accountants, but how they do it is, I don't know. Okay. Now, the spring of '44, things are going pretty well, but the spring of '44, this is it shouldn't be a surprise, it was a surprise to me. They get notice from the government that they're going to close down the unit in June. Well, spring of '44, you're going to have, by June, you're going to have the D-Day. It's beginning to look as though we're going to win the war, and maybe win it very quickly. And these officer trainees are taking a couple of years at an undergraduate institution, and then another year or so. In case of my brother graduated high school, moved across the street, joined the Navy, and was in that unit across the street from our house. But then he had midshipman school to do after that, so it's taking the better part of 3 years to graduate a trained officer. Well, they think in 1947, are we going to need these people? Maybe not. In fact, they wouldn't. And so they closed the unit. And that subtracts $234,500 from a $539,000 budget. So it cuts it virtually in half. So immediately they have to make large bank loans, and Joe does this time have a successful solicitation of the trustees. And they also got a grant from the Coles Foundation, which probably came through Joe. Joe had a lot of influence with the Coles family. So there's, temporarily till they get to the influx of veterans. So now, the veterans. There are 1,200 students by 1947. 60% of the faculty were hired between 1946 and 1949. Just a tremendous wave of faculty. The Fitches were part of that. Sam Stevens had a lot to do with hiring. My generalization is that he hired good people and he fired good people. We as students would have mysterious disappearances over the summer of people we thought were good teachers that weren't back. You really didn't dare oppose Sam. And now we're sort of going to get into the period when Sam begins to have some problems. I refer to him as Sam. I hope you don't mind if I do that, because that's the way we students refer to him, Doc Sam or Sam. He had I'd say, a very successful presidency during the war. He negotiated difficult circumstances very well. And It was a much more imperial period for presidencies, but Stevens loved the imperial role. It's what I see in the minutes. It's what I see in Joe Rosenfield's reaction. It's what we as students saw, was a man of supreme self-confidence. I'll tell you two stories here quickly. They're personal stories. I was a candidate for a special scholarship that we had called the Baker Scholarship. How I was with that kind of high school record, I don't know, but I think I might have gotten good SAT scores or something. And we were, it was a very smart program because the college got maybe 50 or so men on campus that were supposedly could be good students and had general other things that they did. And then they're going to give 10 of those scholarships, plus they'll give other scholarships to the other students. So they could get them here. We had a battery of tests on campus, and we had a interview with a faculty member and a board member, an administrator. My interview was with Sam Stevens. My dad knew Sam because he was a fellow college president, and they were both Congregationalists and went to congregational meetings. So I felt very confident. I'm going to go in and see my dad's friend. And Sam said, Mr. Drake, he said, there's a high grade point average needed for the same scholarship. Let's say you don't make that grade point average and you lose the scholarship. What would you do? Would you borrow money so you could stay in college, or would you go home and work and try to make some money and come back? What is the answer? I'm sort of flashing through, my whole career and I finally said, I'd borrow. And he went, good. I said, I had a young man in here before you. You think he'll borrow? No. You think I'll give him a scholarship? No. If you don't think enough of your education and yourself to borrow on it, we don't think enough of you to give you a scholarship. I've since asked John Kleinsman and others who actually were not Stevens supporters, would he have done that? And they said, oh yeah, he did things like that all the time. But I don't know whether he would have been that categorical or not. But that's the way he came across. Another one I can't help, the storyteller, I guess. Sam Stevens had a Bachelor of Divinity degree, which was the professional degree for ministry in those days, as well as a PhD in psychology. He was an industrial psychologist, was his specialty. He came from Northwestern to Grinnell. And he would always preach the Thanksgiving sermon. And he told about living in Grinnell house then, and he heard some rumbling downstairs in the middle of the night, and he came down, and there was a man stealing the silver. And by the way, the title of the sermon was Going the Extra Mile. And he sat that man down and convinced him of the errors of his ways and let him go. And that man later did something good for the college or for Sam, and that's of course a real, what shall I say, not the pure notion of going the extra mile. You're going to get something back is what he was telling us. And as I was leaving, John Kleinsmith, with whom I had a lot of courses, came in. Mr. Drake, he said, have you ever heard that story before? Oh no, Dr. Kleinsmith, the bishop's candlesticks from Les Miserables. In other words, he was telling me that was plagiarism. And Sam, by this time, and this is probably was 54, when he's almost at the end of the line, he had a hard time determining what truth was. I guess I have to say it's a little like our current president. If I believe it, it must be true. He had a hard time making that separation. And his style, as things really began to fall apart in the 50s, just did not match the mood of the college or the mood of the time, because he overplayed his imperialism. Let's put it that way. Okay, so let's move on to that part of the story. With all this overcrowding, and going back to the veterans coming, the college bought used military barracks from the government, We remember the barracks. That's where the married, lots of married students, a lot of married students lived. Our student union was a big barracks, located right where the forum is now. It wasn't bad. We enjoyed it. It had a nice fireplace and a pretty good grill. They bought 10 prefab houses. I've mentioned that before. You and John lived in one. Bunch of some on Spring. There was one on West Street. There were a bunch on East Street that have been torn down since because of a parking lot. But there are 3 or 4 of those towns that are still. Most of them have been added on to. They were either sold to faculty or rented to faculty. So the colleges in the town are dealing with overcrowding. They just aren't set up for 1,200 students. Luce Hall was built in 1950, the Yonker Hall in 1951, Yonker with a lot of help from Joe Rosenfield. And then we come to the Science Building, which is a critical building project for a lot of reasons. World War II, and think of the atomic bomb coming out of World War II. We in a sense, we sealed the win in the war by science, through science. We happened to make the scientific discovery here. Germany was working on it hard. We beat them partly because of the Jewish refugees, a lot because of the Jewish refugees. So that's probably front and center. Radar's development. I mean, we saw the utility of natural science, and so we really need to advance, particularly the facilities for the United Natural Science as well as the faculty. The Science Building was Blair Hall. Many of us in this room remember Blair Hall. In fact, there was a discussion in the trustees, should we make it a modern building or should we build another Gothic structure? They quickly decided it would be a modern building. Now, those of us who know and love that building know that the initial building was not beautiful. Those of us who came in 1952 enjoyed it in its very first iteration. It began and it was up and running in 1952. And it leaked then. And among other things, the biology department had a butterfly roof, so that all of the rain went to the center. It was supposed to drain. It didn't drain very well. When I was a candidate for president, it was raining cats and dogs, and they took me around. We went to the science building, we went into the chemistry lab, and there were all these funnels up here with tubes coming down from into the sinks. My feeling was if a bunch of historians would have just sat there and gotten wet, but the chemists had a solution to the problem. So it was a flat roof, so there were a lot of problems. The one thing you can say about the building is that accepted its 4 additions with grace. It's a very hard building to get around because it's, you know, I can't find my way there. I think the denizens of it can find their way around. But it was so nondescript that it could easily be added on to without concern about destroying the quality of the architecture. I'm going to turn to Gene Welpels here for a minute because I was talking about this. And once we used to, when they lived in Kearney, we would go to our cabin and stop and stay there overnight. They were a great rest stop for us. And I was talking about this at the time. You know, I was in the midst of this, and Gene said, "Oh, there's an NSF report about this. Tell me a little bit about this." I'll repeat it, Gene.
Well, at this time, as George points out, there's a lot of interest in trying to revitalize science instruction at colleges. So NSF sponsored a conference on doing teaching and research at colleges, at the College of Worcester in about 1950, it must have been about 1959. And in it is a section on all the colleges, and these were the elite colleges in the country, it had a list there of the science buildings that had been built at these colleges in the previous roughly 6 years, which included the science building at Grinnell College, the one that George has been talking about. The astonishing thing is that there is a line in that big table that lists the cost per square foot. and the cost per square foot of the Grinnell College Science Building was about double the cost per square foot of other science buildings that have been built in the Midwest. Really strikingly expensive. And we have discovered in the building some of the reasons why, and they're not good. They were product of mistakes. So there are at least 3 major mistakes that I could see, and I was told by Professor Danforth about these mistakes in the building of the building that simply added to the cost without giving any benefit. So,
Thank you. Well, it was about $34 a square foot, which was very high for that time. 74 colleges built in that time. You had no, and this is the important, you had no choice. If you're going to be a self-respecting good college, let alone a great college, you have to have a new science building. And we had to have it. And interestingly enough, as I told Gene, Rudy Weitz had just become the chair of the board. Joe had been chair from 48 to 52. The only time he was chair. He essentially was chair all the time, but that was the only time he was formally the chair. And Rudy said he would build it. The Weitz Construction did it at cost. So he may have, but then maybe all these mistakes that were made along the way was what added the cost. Because I think anyone who worked in that building would not say it was the finest science building they'd ever been in. It's getting better with each addition. It's really a great building now, but it didn't start out that way. Now, it's set at well over $800,000. It ended up costing $1 million, and we'll stop here with this story on the science building. But it's a really important story. Stevens is under tremendous pressure. We gotta have it. We've got to have it. The board's giving it. The faculty's giving it. And he's not getting the money raised. At the time that they decided to build, and Joe made the motion to build, they raised $483,000 of the 800 plus thousand. And in that $483,000 was a $100,000 pledge from the Marshall Field Foundation. That's critical because it turns out there was never any such pledge. But so they really only have $383,000 of what's going to turn out to be $1 million building. But the pressure is so great and Stevens isn't getting the money raised. He was not a good fundraiser. And so he's desperate. And in his desperation, it turns out he forged the letter from Marshall Field. He's that desperate. Well, we'll get into the forgery in a little bit. So they go ahead and the building is completed by the fall of 1952. So those of us who enjoyed it, and we all had to take a lab science course as a requirement. So we were almost all of us in that building that first year did not realize what a momentous thing we were a part of, but it was momentous. So I'll say one more thing about this period. The budgets actually were balanced from 46 through 49. While the veterans were here, when the government finally paid, why the budgets would be balanced. So what we're going to do after the break is we'll get into the real crisis that Stevens faces, and some of us in the room are part of the reason. We are Depression babies. I was born in 1934 at the depth of the Depression. There weren't enough of us. That's why John Fitch was off beating the bushes along with other people to find warm bodies to come to Grinnell. So we'll talk about the warm bodies after the break.
All right, we're ready to start in on the second half of George's stories. There we go, third grade.
Get this on again.
Mary Lou was just mentioning that the silent generation, on these analyses of various generations, and that does have something to do with the fact that we as students weren't in the middle of all this. My own feeling is that those of us who were kids during World War II learned to make the sort of British expression, make do. You can't change things. it's the war. You're not going to get chocolate. You're not going to get good meat. We're not going to travel. We don't have gas coupons and so on. And we've got to go out and collect kapok from the fields for life jackets and all that full. Collect cans. I had a backpack full of flattened cans that I would march around with, and then we give them to the war effort and so on. We were meant to adjust to the situation. And that was a term that my parents used. Maladjusted or not well adjusted. Don't be maladjusted, adjust. We were adjusters. We still are, I think. And we were the silent generation of students. We weren't about to get in the middle of all this, but we were somewhat cynical about it all. We weren't stupid about it, but I guess we weren't going to do anything about it. That's the point. Okay, we're going to get into the Depression babies and the Korean War. All of a sudden, the student stream dries up. Veterans are gone, and the replacements are not nearly as numerous as they're going to be in a few years when you get the baby boomers and so on. So enrollment drops from 1,200 into the mid-800s at best. Then the Korean War is going on. And there's a real panic on the board. We've got to get another military unit. In this case, ROTC, so the students who are in college can receive training. And so we got an Air Force ROTC unit. I had no idea arriving in the fall of '52 when that began. It actually began the year before, in the fall of '51. And every one of us, I had a blue Air Force uniform, wore it every Tuesday and Thursday, marched every Tuesday and Thursday. The upper class students were the officers, and they marched us. Tom Railsback, later representative from the Moline area in the U.S. Congress, was my flight lieutenant, leader. He kept marching us into the dorms, and then would laugh about it. We'd pile up in the dorms and so on. Anyway, it wasn't always the best military training. We took military science, and I learned at what altitude is the maximum for the explosion of a nuclear weapon, and so on, these kinds of things. And then many of my fellow students went on into you had to be in the first 2 years, and then if you were going to become an officer, you stayed in the next 2 years. And a lot of our classmates did. I did not. And so that actually saved the college from losing a lot of men, because Korea did not affect the colleges nearly. It wasn't even close to what World War II did. At this point, the college had come to a point with all of this drop and with the loss of the government revenue for the military unit, where it was borrowing so much, and oftentimes to make payroll, that many of the banks were refusing to loan anymore. We were a very poor risk. Today, Grinnell is AAA. One of the few colleges, universities in the nation that can claim AAA status. We could borrow anywhere, anytime, any amount. We don't, fortunately, we're not. But borrowings, this building up here is being built with a lot of borrowing. So the college is borrowing and using its AAA rate, which means you get very favorable rates. But I guess the college's rating then would have been F. It could not have been lower. So they're having to do inter-fund borrowing, and those transfer funds around, particularly out of endowment areas into current operations. And I won't go into the details, but several times, Joe by this time is chair of the finance committee, so he makes the motions. And he's having to make motions. For example, in 1946, they had a second century fund. It raised $1 million as the college entered the second century, which was supposed to go for endowment, but they ended up using it for current operations. And Joe makes those motions. That was very hard for him to, I mean, I know him well on that issue. The endowment for Joe was sacrosanct. Certainly when I knew it was, you don't touch it. Joe would never, he's got to be spinning in his grave as we spent endowment money on buildings. We've done it a lot. But Joe would never allow endowment to be used for buildings. It was there for the preservation of the college and for providing annually certain funds for the operating. But today, the endowment supports about 50% of the operating budget. When I was president, we got to 20%, and the board was panicked about that. Way too high. There was only one college, Swarthmore, that had an equal draw on his endowment. But look where we are today and the degree to which the endowment does support the institution. So Stevens at 52 is presenting a very gloomy picture to the board. He's already been through, they've got the science building at this point under construction. This is April 52, the spring before some of us arrived. And he says to the board, and he's really sort of desperate to find some reasons or excuses for the problems. This generation of students, he says, has poor character. It's the fault of the family and social conditions. Colleges like Grinnell have an almost impossible task, but he says, we struggle valiantly. Unless we succeed, the hope of a good society must be indefinitely deferred. The indifference of students of college age to serious discipline, social, and academic responsibility is shocking. It's not directly a description of Carol or MJ or me, but we're coming, and we're part of that generation. In November of 52, after we've arrived, he's more optimistic. He quotes one of Napoleon's generals at Austerlitz. This is really classic Stevens. Said this general, my right is falling back, my center has disintegrated, my left is faltering, I have given the order to attack. And then he challenges the board, let us go forward, let us be satisfied with no mean plans, let us not be discouraged by temporary difficulties. And then he proposes a $2 million endowment campaign, and actually Joe is the one who offers the resolution to proceed with that. I like that quote of Stevens. It really is classic Stevens. He would, if you look at the board minutes, he gives about a 20-minute speech at the beginning of every board meeting. And it's in the minutes. And it's, well, very imperialistic, let's put it that way. So Joe offers this resolution, and this is really interesting. He says that the trustees at this time reaffirm their faith in the principles and objectives of Grinnell College as administered by Dr. S.N. Stevens. I'll say that again. The trustees at this time reaffirm their faith in the principles and objectives of Grinnell College as administered by Dr. S.N. Stevens. Is it really a resolution of, the board passes it. Is this a resolution of support of Stevens or of the college or what? It's not quite clear. And Stevens sees this, and he gives a very injudicious response. He expressed himself as being somewhat bewildered at some of the opinions expressed, saying, you can't go forward and backward at the same time. You can't be positive and negative at once. And this is sort of an attack on Joe, because Joe has been pushing for reduction of cost. He's really been a bird dog on expenses. You can't cross a chasm in 2 jumps. It seems impossible to reduce the size of the operation at the same time maintain physical plant, improve faculty, increase the size and standards of the student body. Grinnell will either be of high value, something which the trustees can be proud of, or it will become nondescript, unattractive, and uninteresting. A reaffirmation of faith is not enough to get done what needs to be done. Merely cutting the budget, increasing enrollment, and reducing faculty is not the answer. He personally would want something better than that for Grinnell. So you can see this is a very crisis kind of trustee meeting where there's a resolution of support, which is not quite a support of Sam. And then he gives his response of, this isn't good enough. So anyway, they moved the $2 million campaign, which is not a success. But the great success that the college is going to have comes, sadly, through death. Fred Darby died in March of 1953. And my interpretation now is that Joe Rosenfield had a lot to do with saving the college, but he might not have been able to save it without Darby's death. Because Darby left the bulk of his fortune to the college. He was an Oklahoma oil and gas man, quite wealthy, by far at this time the wealthiest of the college's trustees, a graduate of the college and devoted to the college and a very good trustee. And they actually have to go through a suit with Darby's wife, who feels it's a she challenges the will and so on. She loses, and the college gains, and college creates something called Poweshiek Oil Company, which is headquartered in Oklahoma, which we still have, and I've said this before, we're still getting oil and gas revenues from the Darby estate. It's still part of the funding of the college. So it's hard to say what it was worth, but at the time it was worth anywhere from $3 to $5 million. I mean, it really is to the eternal credit of the trustees. They didn't sell it. They didn't sell it. They were desperate, but they did not sell. They kept, but they did. Darby had made other gifts, and they did give securities. They did sell, use the other gifts for operations. They had been intended for endowment, but they were used for operations, and the securities were used. But this tied the college through a very, very, very tough time. And I think we as students heard something about the Darby bequest as being very important. And I can remember the figure $5 million being thrown around. The college had just gotten a big gift of $5 million, something like that. I'm a bit vague about it, but it was well known that the college was benefiting considerably from that. So this is what gets us through. But I'm going to just go back here for just a minute. I've turned over one page too many. In August of 1953, there was an executive committee meeting in Des Moines. And I think, I have no firm proof, but I know Joe, and I know conditions that this particular event described. Stevenson's come in, they're considering the budget for the coming year, the 53-54 year, which has been his last. And he says, we've just got to increase faculty salaries. I'd like to get 25,000 more into the faculty salary pool. And then he gives as his specific reason, he says that the following institutions have made offers to our faculty, one or another of our faculty, at a higher salary than we're paying, and none have accepted them. He says Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, Chicago, Penn, Northwestern, Berkeley, Stanford, Oberlin, Amherst, and Pomona. And nobody accepted an offer from one of those institutions at a higher salary than Grinnell was paying. It's unbelievable to me. And then he lists faculty that they could not possibly afford to lose. And he lists about 15. John's one of them. Do you remember John getting an offer from Harvard or Princeton? Oh, he did have an offer. Okay, that's good. But I could list, those of us from that era would recognize all of these, and they're outstanding folks. But interestingly, the ones not mentioned are interesting. Gale, Norton, Strauss, Kleinschmidt, Clapp, Ragsdale, Robertson. In other words, his opponents were not in that group who had received an offer. Well, this is very interesting. Joe moves he's chairman of the finance committee. Let's add 25,000, and I will give him another 5,000. And then Fred Maytag adds 5,000, so it's going to be 35,000. So that's the immediate response. But my sense is that this was probably, may have been the straw that broke the camel's back as far as Joe was concerned. This clearly was a lie. Stevens is not telling him the truth. He's playing with the board. He's maneuvering the board. Joe allows himself to be maneuvered, but if there was anything that Joe hated, it was dishonesty. And I can take person after person after person that I've interviewed said, one thing, when Joe would turn against someone, was because of dishonesty. If he was lied to, that was it. So, I'm going to quote now from my manuscript. There's a January 1954 board meeting. Their intention was to meet with a group of faculty that day. That meeting was called off, and the board went into all-day executive session. And this is what the minutes from Rupert Hawk indicate. The plan had to be abandoned, that is to meet with the faculty, at the last moment because of the pressure of certain emergency matters. After convening in the drawing room of Main Hall, the trustees went into executive session attended by themselves only. None of the officers of the administration or faculty representing being present. The executive session lasted all day, Friday, January 29th, during which time matters of trustee policy were discussed, but no formal action of any kind was taken according to the information given the secretary for the purposes of noting in the minutes of the meeting. There it is. But then the minutes go on to say, Mr. Joseph Rosenfield wished to retire from the board, and that created a vacancy as to the chairmanship of the finance committee. So Joe has resigned at the conclusion during that meeting. In addition, board chair Rudy Watts announced that he would have to retire as president of the board because of his duties in Washington. His duties in Washington made it difficult to work closely with the college president. During a protracted lunch involving only trustees, Whites withdrew his resignation as board president, but Joe's decision to resign held firm. That's not a quote of the minutes, but that's a quote of me. So Joe has resigned from the board over Sam. Obviously, the board meeting was to discuss whether to continue Sam or not. The board decided to continue him, and Joe decides to resign rather than accept that and continue to work with Sam. So for 6 months, Joe's off the board. And I think we're going back to Sam's departure, but his departure and Joe's return may be the most critical moment in college history. If Joe had stayed away, where would we be? But fortunately, he didn't stay away. And interestingly, in the class letters, those of us who are graduates are used to our class letter. It's one of Grinnell's great accomplishments, actually. Very few alumni associations have anything remotely resembling our class letters. Well, Joe Fell was the author of the class of 25 letter. It was notorious. If you ever were a class as Joanne was, you may have heard of Joe Fell's letters. They were, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 pages long. And in April, after Joe's resigned, he produces a wonderful letter about how the college is in desperate situation and we as alums have really got to step up and contribute. So his bitterness over Stevens is not bitterness toward Grinnell. I found that really interesting, that he's still, right in there plugging as hard as he can as an alum. And he says, as a former trustee, I can tell you the circumstances are quite dire. We've just got to step up. So, in June of 7th of 1954, Stevens resigns after the board meeting. And interestingly, here's the first thing you see in the notes after noting Stevens' resignation. The minutes say, the point was raised that Mr. J.F. Rosenfield would reconsider his resignation from the board. Mr. Wells, chairman of the Committee on Trustees, made a motion seconded by Mr. Kirkpatrick and carried unanimously that Mr. J.F. Rosenfield be asked to reconsider his resignation from the board and that he be invited to complete his unexpired term of the class of '59. Joe returned and immediately was put on the search committee that got Howard Bowen. So, anyway, well, I've said enough about Sam Stevens. I think, to try to sum up what it was, maybe Grant Gale has the best summary. The story about the forgery is from Grant Gale's notes of this period. Grant was a critical organizer of opposition to Sam. In fact, a group of faculty had gone to the board and said, this guy's got to go. And Grant was one of those faculty. And Grant is the source of the story about the forgery. I mean, the minutes don't mention any forgery of the trustees, but that's where that comes from. Here's what Grant said. I'm glad I knew him. I'm glad he left. I wish for his sake and the college's that he had left earlier when he was still winning. So it does give due credit to what he accomplished. And I think every one of us would say that Sam did build a good faculty. And it was much of his doing. I mean, he made significant contributions to the college, but also really put the college through a grinder. And I will say, this is my private observation, having presided at Grinnell, that this incident, this period, formed faculty leadership. There was a sense that, and Russ, I think, could bear this out with Glenn's experience. The faculty decided after this, never again will we have a president that will lead us around by the nose. We are going to be a strong enough body, we're committed enough to this institution that we will watch the administration carefully, we will participate in the governance of this college, we'll do what it takes, take the time that it takes and the energy that it takes to be part of the governance of this institution, and don't trust the president. And I agree with that. I try to be trustworthy, but the faculty should. Why? Don't trust the president. You should bird dog the president. You should watch one of my closest friends, Alan Jones, and Glenn Kleinsmith, both my teachers, were watching me like hawks. And rightly so. And I think this is when this general sense of faculty leadership developed. Now, I think some of that's going away slightly, but it was strong during the Bowen years, the Leggett years, and the subsequent years, I'd say up to fairly recently. And it's not bad now, but faculty is so busy now with their research and their teaching and families and so on. There's a lot of energy and time left to try to run the college. Someone like Al Jones, it was a third of his obligation, or close to a third or a half of his obligation to watch the store. Because he cared about the college, and that's the great thing about this. You want faculty invested in the institution that care about it enough to help govern it. And that I think is one of the most positive results of the Sam Stevens years, is that sense of faculty responsibility and governance. And they realized they had a role in helping to get rid of Sam. And so anyway. So now we're going to go to a very happy story, the Howard Bowen years. Those of us who were on campus when Howard arrived, I could say we felt a breath of fresh air. It seemed like something was happening. Certainly the faculty was very much more positive and hopeful about the future of the institution. I think I said this before, and I'll say it again. I think the two really seminal presidencies at Grinnell were Gates and Bowen, the sort of transformational presidencies. And you know, Howard had a lot to transform, and by and large, he managed to accomplish it. He was president from 1955 to 1964. He, just a little bit about his background, he was from the state of Washington, born in Spokane, and went to Washington State for his BA, and he got his PhD from the University of Iowa in economics. Howard was an economist, and a very good economist, and professionally was probably one of the 2 or 3 leading economists of higher education. Higher education became his specialty. I remember this is what a great economist can do if they're not tied too much to the math. He said, he became a trustee later, and I served with him on the board. He said, you know, college education is usually the cost of a medium-sized American car. And that was true until fairly recently. Not too many medium-sized American cars are $60,000 a year, $60,000 a person. But by and large, I mean, this is where the economists can really elucidate things. Do you think things are getting really expensive? Well, think about some basic commodities in our society, like a car and education. Pretty good if you can get an education annually at the cost of buying a car. He started his teaching at the economics department, University of Iowa. That's good to keep in mind because, as you know, he eventually becomes president at Iowa. Then during the war, he was the chief economist of the Congressional Committee on Internal Revenue. And then following the war, he was at Irving Trust as an economist. And then, interestingly, this is the first time I ever heard of him. He was dean of the Graduate School of Commerce at the University of Illinois from 47 to 52. And I do remember as a kid, a high school student in Illinois, hearing about Bowen being fired because he was a Keynesian economist, and this is the McCarthy period, and he was thought to be way too close to the communists. And so he got fired at Illinois and landed on his feet teaching economics at Williams College. And that's where he was when he was hired as president of Grinnell College. What did he find when he got here? I've already told you that what Don Smith's remarked, that he found a good faculty, a good teaching faculty. Now, not that it didn't need improvement, and not that Howard didn't help improve it. He found a college in deep financial trouble. At his first meeting, he found the farms were worth about $650,000 with an income on a good year of $15,000 coming from them. Total debt to the banks was $570,000, and the total debt within the inter-fund borrowing that you needed to return to other funds was $575,000. So at a time when the dollar was $1, in 1955, it's over $1 million in debt that has to be serviced, has to be. And then at this meeting also, Dean Homer Norton says of our students, and I'm afraid this one really does apply to us, because this is 1955. We're the senior leadership that year, Carol and MJ. It says the college, it said parents send their students, their kids to small colleges as havens for maladjusted children. There's that term, maladjusted. Adding that the lower third of students are poorly prepared for college, either academically or morally. But they are easy to get and able to pay their way. But they are poison to a healthy academic community. I mean, that's a pretty dismal description of college students. I hope there's no one at college that describes current students in anything remotely like that, and I don't think they do. They might say they're spoiled, or they don't, aren't willing to hear opposing views. That's the kind of things floating around today in society, but that they're a poison to society. Definitely not. So this was not an auspicious beginning for Howard to be greeted with this kind of information. But I'm going to do this quickly, and then I'll come back with a few details of it. It's a transformational time for the college. And I'd say the basic thing you see in these trustee minutes, it really is striking when you look at the minutes. The references are changing from regional, statewide, to national. You're suddenly aware Grinnell might be part of a national group of colleges, a national educational environment. The Ford Foundation has never crossed those minutes before. NSF, Rockefeller, they're not there. We weren't looking in that direction. The sites of the, one of Howard's great contributions, sites of the institution are raised. I'll say this a little later, but I'm not saying it now because we're running out of time. The comparison group that he puts together, colleges all function with comparisons on salaries, on this, that, and the other thing. And we now have an official group of comparable institutions at the college that is referred to, and a lot of statistics are embedded in that comparison. Howard introduces essentially that same group. Williams, Amherst, Swarthmore, Wellesley, and so on. These are the schools we want to compare ourselves to. Now, at that time, it was a stretch. Carleton, Oberlin are in there, Pomona. The same group that we're looking at today. We would like to think we are as good as in part of the same environment. The college didn't even dream of doing that. Maybe people thought of Oberlin. Oberlin was kind of, when I was at Grinnell, Oberlin was sort of the pinnacle of small colleges. So we were aware of that. But in fact, it blows my mind that on most national surveys, we're ahead of Oberlin. I can't believe that. Oberlin has always been right up here for me. So just getting people to think in a different set of categories was really important. There's going to be curricular change in the late 50s. A new curriculum is inserted that particularly focused around something called humanities, the humanities sequence, the courses which we still have at Grinnell, and historical studies sequence. I was a sabbatical replacement in 60-61, and I taught in the historical studies part of that curriculum. It was terrific. Those of us who were in that cadre of teachers would meet weekly for lunch to discuss the readings. Howard Burkle would lead us through the Luther readings, that kind of thing. And then one person, oftentimes Alan Jones, would be the lecturer. 2 lectures a week and 2 discussion sections a week of a sort of modern European history sequence. It was a great curriculum. They debated and passed a junior liberal arts exam, which turned out not to work very well. But there was, for a couple of years, every junior had to take, did you have to take the liberal arts exam?
That was the year after me, thank goodness.
Well, and Dorothy's here, the Grinnell Travel Fellowships. You went to say a word about that, Dorothy. This is something, they used the residue of the Grinnell and London Endowment to create this program.
My senior year, 8 of us went off scattered across the world to teach, and this was the Travel Service Scholarship. I went to Malawi in Central Africa, and it was probably the best experience I have had in my life. And Phil and I were actually married there. So, but we were sent to schools in countries that were not independent at that time, and it was really a rewarding program. And then we reported back to campus to encourage other people to apply for this. The college paid for our transportation to and from, and the host institutions paid for our living expenses there.
So, you know, a wonderful opportunity for 8 graduates to go off and serve in the world in really interesting places and to have that service paid for by the college. Quite an unusual thing. We're doing that now, but we've got a lot more money to do that. Now, the students' body improved dramatically. Dramatic, not the term to use. It was slow. It was a slow process. Demographics are turning in the college's direction, particularly from 58 on. There are a lot more warm bodies and ambulatory bodies out there, and you begin to be selective. And this is this is the intelligence of Howard, and sense of you know, what shall I say, leadership and administrative quality. He said, we should improve quality and then we'll get quantity. But let's go for quality first. Well, one thing, there'll be much more retention. These students will be capable. I mean, the standards really never, during the time of this terrible description when I was there about the student body, the standards were pretty high. It was hard to get a good grade. And these were tough courses. And Eric was asking me in the breaks, how do you ever get a Rhodes Scholarship? You mean that stupid in high school? he didn't use those words. And I said, you know, I decided to turn over a new leaf. I didn't work hard in high school. I was going to work hard in college. But it wasn't hard. The courses were so interesting. It was fun to work hard, I found. I did work hard. But Grinnell turned me on in a desperate time at the college. I mean, that really shows what a great college it is. You know, it just, anyway. So by improving the quality of the students, the graduate student body gradually gets larger and a good deal better. I mean, the students I taught in 1661, Dorothy was one of them, were very good students. Athletics. Gates pushed and sort of created athletics at Grinnell. Howard Bowen believed in athletic excellence to the degree that scholar athletes. And 4 or 5 of those scholar athletes brought in Howard's time became trustees of the college, and very good trustees of the college. But the college, believe it or not, we won 2 successive football championships in the Midwest Conference. We won John Fitch's team won basketball championship. Track was regularly conference champions, and then some of the ones we usually win, like cross country, were winning, and swimming, we were winning, and kept on winning. We became the dominant force in the Midwest Conference. So what I'm going to, Joanne's showing me the clock, so I'm going to respect your time and her direction. What we'll do next time, I'll do a little bit more about Howard Bowen, give just a little more chapter and verse, and also talk about Howard wasn't perfect. Where Howard met his Waterloo was when students began to push revolutionary programs, and Howard didn't know how to handle it. And those of us who knew Howard, I'd say that's not too surprising. He was stiff and formal, not terribly approachable, at least to the students. And he had a hard time when that began. And very thankfully handed it over to Glenn Leggett, where the storm came. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into the storm, the student revolution. And I can tell you those trustee minutes, they don't have a clue what's coming. They don't have a clue. And I guess, I was an administrator in those years at Howard College, and I'd say, yeah, we didn't have a clue. We soon learned. But it just swept over the colleges. So I don't mean to ignore you. Arlen Mitchell there, the class ahead of us, and has a good... Arlen had a different student experience. He was married, living in the barracks. He also worked, think of this, worked virtually full-time for the college, as well as being a very good student. He really had an very different career from the rest of us. And Arlen could tell you, and I'll steal the words out of his mouth because we're running out of time. One of the first things Howard Bowen did when he came was pay local bills. The college owed money all over town. And, well, tell them, Arlen, what they did to you.
I was working for the Buildings and Grounds, and they decided that in their faculty development program they needed another office for a new faculty person. So to do that, they had to build a wall to make 2 offices out of one. So they sent us down to York Lumber to get the 2x4s and so forth to build the wall. They said, you can't have this because the college still owes us money. And you can only have it if you go back and get a cashier's check to pay for the items that you got on this list. So we had to go back to the office to Norris Nevelin. We got a cashier's check, we got the 2x4s, and we built the wall.
And I think these guys do exactly what they were doing. They got tired of going through these things. Let's let these young guys. Okay, we're finished, so we'll do a little bit more with Howard next time. Then we'll get into Glenn Leggett's very interesting time and the way Joe dealt with that. And one final thing. Joe and Howard were like this. Everything that Howard wanted to get done with the board, Joe would be the most man moving it. Joe had finally found a president who shared the same vision for Grinnell that he did and that he could work with. It was a wonderful period for Joe and a wonderful period for Howard because he depended heavily on Joe's support. So, we stop.
Thank you, Joe. I just have to tell you a story about Orland as long as he has captured our attention. He was the fix-it man, and of course the South Campus dorms were all women. And whenever somebody's dad or brother came onto the floor, there was a shout that went out, "Oh, man on the floor, man on the floor." And all the women had to be sure they were covered up, not in their jammies or whatever. And once in a while we'd have somebody say, "Man on the floor, man on the floor." Oh, it's just a plumber. So I don't know how I got into Grinnell College in 1952, but I think being a full-pay student didn't hurt. So remember to sign up for ACES. Next week, bring back your folders because George may have some references from his handouts that he wants to make. If you brought an umbrella this morning, remember to take it with you. Turn on your cell phone and turn off the tea coil, and we'll see you all next week. Stay.